You're watching the Security Brief here on BBC News as we unpack the disbanding of the Kurdistan Workers Party, also known as the PKK. And we're joined now by Sinan Ciddi, who is a senior fellow on Turkey at the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies, which is a US-based think tank. Thank you very much for being with us. And we've been talking about this pretty dramatic decision by the PKK to lay down their arms, to disband. What do you think is going on here? What's behind this?
Well, that's a good question. It's almost a 50-year struggle, right? And I think similar thoughts were going, through the minds of the IRA when it was back in the Good Friday agreements back in the late 1990s. Look, I think the PKK has been doing a lot of soul searching, but also they've been watching the actions of the Republic of Turkey since the downfall of the Assad regime and the ground shifting momentum that's been building in the region since the fall of the regime. Look, the Turks seem to have the ascendancy in the region. They've seen and been somewhat behind the precipitous fall of the Assad regime. The Turks seem to be championing and standing behind the new regime there. And Turks, the Erdogan government seems to be sort of the rising star in the region. They've demonstrated their ability to see the waning influence of the Iranian and the Russian regimes there. They have an outsized influence there behind the new regime there. The Israelis seem to be worried in terms of how much, influence they have going forward in the region. The PKK is looking at this and potentially thinking, look, we may have just done about as much mile as we can get with the muzzle of a gun, and we may just need to sit down with Erdogan and finally sort out our differences because, we can't necessarily do much more with the butt of a rifle. So we need to just essentially cut our losses and essentially get to the negotiating table at this point.
Sinan, it's Mikey Kay here. You're speaking of guns and rifles, and that's a brilliant lead into my next question. There seems to be a vacuum of intelligence or knowledge about the PKK's logistical supply chains in terms of funding and weapons. Do you have any information at all on where the PKK might have got that from?
You've hit one of the nails on the head, so to speak. I mean, that's an age-old question. That's kind of an opaque sort of mystery, right? So where do these come from? Historically, we've known that they've had access to these through sort of Syria. The Hafez al-Assad regime was instrumental in supplying the PKK because he had a vested interest in destabilizing Turkey based on, his acrimonious relationship with the Kemalist regime or the secular regime in Turkey going back decades. Similarly, with the PKK, with the Iraqi regime under Saddam Hussein, we've known that, the PKK's had, the ability to supply them. But, that changed the tune when obviously, with the fall of Saddam Hussein, the KRG, after it was established, wanted to make, better inroads with the Turkish government. So that's stopped it. More recently, who knows? I mean, they've had, your guess is as good as mine. That is a very opaque question. But I think a more interesting question is if this peace deal continues to proceed downstream and as it matures, if this is going to be a lasting peace, a more interesting question that I'd be interested to find out is who's going to verify the laying down of weapons beyond use, as we saw with the IRA process, and where will that take place and who will verify it? Will it be the UN? Will it be international observers? Will it be the Republic of Turkey? Will it be the United Nations? Who will verify that and to whose satisfaction? I think there are a lot of unanswered questions here.
Yeah, you raise a good point. In military parlance, we call it DDR, disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate. And I think the monitoring authority is key to that. That's a cracking point. Also, in military parlance, we talk about whenever we're trying to identify a threat of an enemy, we talk about critical capabilities and critical vulnerabilities. Now, one of the critical capabilities I would observe is definitely the mountainous region where the PKK stronghold is. But what do you think the critical vulnerabilities were of the PKK?
So, look, one of the things that the PKK has learned over time is that it's never been able to essentially achieve its goals of secession vis-a-vis in terms of grabbing land from the Turkish state to establish a Kurdistan. That sort of feeling began to mature as the late 1990s wore on, but certainly with the capture of Öcalan. But certainly now, one of the other things that, is worth pointing out in this day and age, which also leads into the answer of the first question as to why it's choosing to essentially sort of approach the Turkish government and achieve a peace deal. And to your question of, what is critical vulnerabilities, is the advancement of military capabilities of the Turkish government and the Turkish military. Turkey is a top 10 military exporter of arms and weapons in this day and age, right? Its capabilities have really sort of grown exponentially from drone warfare to satellite to tracking capabilities. And this really is, the PKK is a guerrilla, organization, and it can and has done outsized damage to the Turkish military, a conventional military. But on the other hand, the Turkish military's ability to hunt down and really penetrate and really do lasting damage and really, penetrate deep to the core of PKK's militants and activities is growing day by day, and they just don't want to face more and more casualties. Bottom line is it's unsustainable what they're doing, and so both entities, both the Turkish state and the PKK, cannot achieve their sort of ambitions, which, the Turkish state wants to eliminate the PKK. And the PKK wants, in an ideal world, to have a Kurdish state. And those things are not achievable. And they have to sit at the negotiating table one way or another. And I think they've realized that finally.
So you talked about how they've essentially sort of given up the military struggle and now just want a political struggle, a political dialogue with the Turkish government and Erdogan. And you were making the comparisons with the IRA. That, of course, ended up with the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, what are we going to see in Turkey in terms of discussions with the Turkish government, some sort of deal, some sort of agreement?
That's a really good question. One major difference between the IRA peace process and the Kurdish peace process, if it's going to unfold, is, look, the British process and the disarmament and the disbanding of the IRA was very open after a point in time, right? We saw this play out in real time. We saw it play out in the media in terms of the government process. There was a lot of information fed out to the public that it could participate in. This is not the case in this version of the Kurdish peace process. It has been done entirely in secrecy. It's shrouded in secrecy, right? It's not in public. We don't know any of the details. All we know is that Öcalan read out a statement in late February, early March. And we understand that the PKK is going to sort of lay down its weapons, and what that will look like and why they're doing it, we don't know. We do also know that Erdogan is doing this because there is a self-motivated self-interest for him, because he needs the Kurds in Turkey, or the Kurdish political party that your colleague alluded to earlier on and before I joined this, saying the HDP, that he needs the votes of the Kurdish parliamentarians in Turkey to make constitutional changes in Turkey so that Erdogan can essentially go for a fourth term as president, right? So it's not necessarily just about sort of a democratic breakthrough in Turkey to resolve the Kurdish question, whereas the British IRA peace process that resulted in the Good Friday agreements was to end the Irish question that had, was so costly to sort of peace and livelihoods in the UK and the British Isles, right? There's a much more sinister and much more sort of politically self-interested a deal here, both from the Kurdish angle, but also from the Erdogan angle, which I think puts a question in the back of mind as to whether it can really succeed, because we just don't know what any of the details are, and and how this will be worked out. But I would also guess that we're a long way away from solution.
Yeah. Well, fascinating to talk it all through with you. That's Sinan Ciddi, the Senior Fellow on Turkey at the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies. Thank you so much for your analysis. Really interesting.